Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright everybody, for today's Critical Thought, we're going to be talking about the importance of launch, or when your game goes 1.0. This is going to be kind of an extension to a Critical Thought we did a few weeks ago about understanding how long a game should be, or when is it time to wrap up a title. Now, when it comes to talking about 1.0 or launch, there's two broad categories I want to focus on for today. The first one is understanding the importance of it. And this is especially true for first-time developers as well as those who have gone the early access route. When you define your game as being 1.0 or the finished build, this is the time that basically the gloves come off for your game. What that means, of course, is when you put this in the hands of reviewers, streamers, whatever, that they don't have to hold back anymore. Usually when a game is in early access and people take a preview of it, they can handle it with kid gloves for the most part. It's not fair to criticize a game that's only 30 or 40% done. It's kind of why I find pre-reviews or stuff like that to be a little disingenuous, because you can't really examine a game, especially those in early access, and give a completed impressions on it. But once the game hits 1.0, this is the time that things are done. And when we say 1.0, for people who are new watching this video, that means that this is the most complete or the best version of your game at that current point in time. And this is the version that you are basically saying, my game is now at a point that I can put it on store shelves, essentially. And there is a danger to doing this too early or not properly preparing your game. And we have seen examples of this, sadly, over the last few years, especially in the early access field, when games are either released too early, or the game just goes on an endless development, and we never hit 1.0, and people will just kind of fizzle out and lose their attention. And the risk and dangers of feature creep is a major topic, and one which we'll probably return to in either a Critical Thought or Industry Insight. Now, to give you an example from my background, as you know, one of my most anticipated games of 2016 was Clockwork Empires by Gaslamp Games. And during the early access period and then to 1.0, I basically wrote two pieces on it. The first was a preview of the game, I think this was a year and a half ago, and then the review after the game was released. And during the preview, I noted that there were concerns I had with the game, but of course I put in the caveat that the game is still in early access, they have time to fix things, they can improve things, and maybe things won't be so bad. Unfortunately, when the game was released and ran into unfortunately, a whole lot of problems, I couldn't hold back anymore, and that's when I kind of went through my list of gripes and problems with the game. And that's the important part about distinguishing your game as 1.0. And more importantly, I also want to point out here, for people who are in early access, they tend to do one of two kinds of releases. They will sometimes do a loud launch, as in, if version 0.9 is 75% of our game, when we hit 1.0, we'll release, the grand final mission, the ending, stuff like that, which is what Darkest Dungeon and Red Hook Games did. The final dungeon ending of the game wasn't at any point in the early access, and it was saved specifically for 1.0. Other developers will go for a soft launch, as in, let's say we go from version 0.9578246, and then we go to 1.0, and it's not really seen as this monumental occasion. Nothing major is added. Basically, this is more or less, flipping the switch, or raising the flag that the game is ready to be reviewed. And there's a lot that can go into marketing your game, especially if you go for a loud launch. But that is probably going to be another topic in of itself. Getting back to the idea of distinguishing your game as 1.0, as I was saying a few minutes ago, this is when your game is ready to be reviewed and examined. And there is a lot of risks when it comes to doing this. It's also, for a lot of developers, very scary because this is when it's make it or break it time. When you say your game is 1.0 and it's on store shelves, you basically begin that ticking time bomb of, who knows, anywhere from a few days to maybe even like a month that will decide whether or not your game will succeed or you may go bankrupt from it. And that is why a lot of developers are very hesitant about saying their game is done. And again, when you begin to announce it to people, this is also where the risks and threat of feature creep come in, because there's always that allure of saying, what if I add one more system? What if I add in another level or another playable character? Maybe this will make my game better and it will sell more. And then 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and next thing you know it, your 2-year game now has an additional 3 years more of development on it. But when it comes to knowing when your game is done, another major part of this, of course, is the idea of day 1 patches, which that could easily be an industry insight video. But for the sake of today, when referring to a day 1 patch, what that usually means is the developer basically sent an earlier version of the game to be considered gold to essentially either meet a timing window by the publisher or to get it out on a certain date. And then the developers will work on more content, bug fixes, whatnot, to then be released alongside the game, essentially taking whatever the time that was spent between the game going gold and the game being on store shelves and translating that into work. Now, there are some obvious pros and cons with that which we don't have enough time to get to today. But the point for our critical thought is that you really need to be careful whenever you are preparing a 1.0 build. One thing that you never ever want to do as a designer is basically say that your game is done, but then tell people that that the real game comes out in 6 months to a year from now after all the DLC and patches are done. When someone buys your game on day 1, they should get a finished experience. The game should be playable from start to end. They shouldn't have any major game-breaking bugs. And if you promise your game to be, a 10-hour experience, then there should be about 10 hours in there. And again, you do not want to underperform or undersell your title that way. Now, the other part for today's critical thought, of course, is how do you know when your game is done? And this is one of those grand topics which there really isn't an easy answer for. And of course, the reason is very obvious. As we've talked about before, game development is not an exact science. Every genre has its own design sensibilities, every studio has its own way of working, and there is no perfect guide to game development, which of course makes it very hard to know just exactly when is a game done. Now, when we talk about video games, there's always two sides of things. We have the game itself, or the entertainment side, the art, the level design, music, sound effects, you name it. The things that the player is going to be experiencing. On the other hand, we have the technical side, making sure the engine works, hoping that someone pushes start and your game doesn't blow up their console. Hopefully not having any kind of weird graphical glitches or levels that are simply unplayable. And making a successful game requires both sides to be treated equally. Now, when it comes to deciding when your game is ready to be launched, when it comes to linear titles, this is a lot easier. When we have a linear or narrative-driven game, there is a fixed known. If my game has 20 levels in it, well, once all 20 levels are finished, bug tested, and refined, the game is done. And of course, if we want to add more levels, we can do that with DLC down the line. This is also why it's a lot easier to project AAA titles that are built on single-player experiences versus untested games. Because again, if we know that our game is supposed to be X levels long or have 50 missions or anything like that, we can have a reasonable idea of when the game's done, and we can start to project that out, and hopefully put out a really good estimate of the release date. Now here's the twist though. What about system-heavy games? These are titles that are not built on a linear set of experiences or level designs, but built on the interactions and complexity of multiple systems interacting with each other. Games like Kerbal Space Program, Subnautica, Factorio, even stuff like Stellaris and Europa Universalis. While these games may have a estimated amount of gameplay to them, it's always about how these systems interact with each other. And because of that, it becomes very hard to know just how much do I need to put into these games. Because whenever you have a system-heavy game like Europa Universalis, RimWorld, and so on, that feature creep alert can really rear its ugly head here. You can start with a survival game and say, okay, we need hunger, but now let's add in thirst. Well, now we have thirst and we need to add water. Well, now we have water, why don't we add realistic liquid physics in our game? Okay, now that that's in, what about allowing us to manipulate liquid? Well, now we have gas. Let's add in gas machinations and physics, and so on and so forth. And on one hand, you are technically making your game better, and especially when it's a systems-heavy game, that the more systems you have, the more they interact with each other, the more fulfilling and enriching the game's going to be. But on the other hand, this will quickly and very easily balloon a game's development. And who knows if all those systems are really going to be appreciated by the player, or if they're going to turn out as well. Because if you have like 20 different systems worth of design mechanics in your game, and only like 4 or 5 of them are really at high level polish, then the rest of them are going to be seen as taking away from the game. This is why games that are built on multiple systems can be a little bit risky. If people love the stealth part of your game but hate combat, well, unfortunately you're going to be stuck with people complaining about, who knows, anywhere from 50 to 75% of your title. Now, when it comes to understanding the launch window, or when it is time to release your game, this goes back to what we were talking about with game length, and understanding your core gameplay loop. The core gameplay loop is the foundation for your title, and everything about your game must stem or flow from it. When your core gameplay loop is done, that's a good signal to stop and see what else needs to be built for your game. I've talked to Chris Park from Arkham Games about this several times with his systems-heavy games like A Valley Without Wind, The Last Federation, and so on. And there, you have to understand the difference between the main content of your game and the ancillary or secondary content. Stuff that's nice to have, but isn't necessarily required by the core experience. And understanding when to release your game, it always has to be about the core gameplay loop. Because if that's not finished, you have a serious problem. And it doesn't matter how many other subsystems or art or sound effects you have done, if the basic element of your game just simply doesn't work. Now, when it comes to the technical side, I am not a programmer by trade, so I can't get too far into this. But talking to people who have done game testing and game programming, it's very important to understand essentially the hierarchy when it comes to technical issues in your game. This is also true of features. Being able to figure out what is the most pressing issue, something that needs to get done or fixed yesterday, versus something that can be wait or something that can be held on, is a very important skill when it comes to project management. If you have 2 bugs in your game, one that causes a character's shirt to turn green when he steps on a tile, and one that causes your game to blue screen of death when you hit start, I think we all know which one's the more important one to fix. But to wrap up today's critical thought, when it comes to knowing when your game is ready to be released, it's one other major aspect of this we have to touch on is the actual release date itself. This is probably one of the last things on your mind as an independent developer, but it's still important to consider. knowing just when your game is going to come out, that can be very much up in the air, as we've all seen with many independent games and even big name titles. When something goes wrong, or if another game is coming out at the exact same time or near it, you may have to push back that release date. And typically, most developers and publishers will give soft dates until they absolutely know for sure that the game is done. I mean, how many times have we heard spring 2017, or of course the Blizzard famous mantra, when it's done, that's when the game comes out. But when it comes to setting a release date for your game, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first is, are there any competitors coming out around the same time? And when we say competitors, we mean either big name titles, as in, if I'm working on a small independent game, and I know the next Call of Duty game is coming out on the exact same day, I may want to move that around. Versus games that are similar in design, such as 2 different strategy games, 2 different horror games, stuff like that. And usually it's always best to try to come out on a day that you know that you are going to be the biggest, or hopefully the biggest name for that day. So if you're working on a platformer and you know that Blizzard's going to be releasing a major update to Overwatch, you may want to push that game back, or if you could, move it up a week or two. Because once that big name is dropped, everyone is going to be following that. Be it developers, game sites, YouTubers, and streamers, they're all going to try to get in on whatever's the big news of that period. Now, one final point, I know I just said that, but whenever we talk about knowing when to release a game or to launch it, there's a famous Shigeru Miyamoto quote that gets brought up. I know for those of you who watch like our Game Wisdom Live segments or listen to the cast and whatnot, we usually talk about this at some point in it. And to paraphrase, basically he said that a delayed game can be good, but a rush game is always bad. And what that simply means is, if your game needs 3 more months of work, don't release the game and then try to get all that work done after 1.0. As we said at the start of our critical thought today, 1.0 is a very big deal. This has to be the best version of your game at that moment in time. And it is far better in terms of public perception and reviews to push a game back 3 months and then release it in a better state versus releasing the game in a worse state and then trying to get back to that finished state 3 months later. And that also goes when it comes to early access. When we talked about game length in the other critical thought, I mentioned that game developers sometimes like to joke that the game is done when they run out of money. And as I said then, that's not good. It's important to understand just about your game's design when it's ready to be released. And you don't want to release the game basically in an emergency situation, because that means that you know it's not going to be completely tested and refined. And the other major mark or the major motto for today's critical thought is this: you only have one chance to release your game. And like I said earlier, that can scare a lot of developers, because now your game is out there, and no one's going to hold back on a game that's considered 1.0. And sometimes you may get lucky, and your game does incredibly well, reviewers love it, and it sells. And then there are times when it doesn't do so well, and who knows what can happen then. But sadly, no game can stay on early access infinitely. If you want to work on your game for 2 to 3 years on the platform, you can, as long as you show progress. But there is no such thing as a game that will be forever in game development, because that's a sign of a developer that has really gotten feature creep crazy, and they don't know what their game is all about. But to talk more about feature creep and the dangers and risks of that, we're going to have to wait for another critical thought. So, thank you so much for watching today's piece. As a quick question for you folks watching. So, for those of you who are developers working on your own game or have finished your own game, what was the major telltale signs that your game was done? Even if you did post-release support, either in the form of new content or DLC, what was that moment that you said to yourself, this is my game. Let's get it onto Steam, or let's get it onto a store, or anything like that. Let me know in the comments below. If you are new and you enjoy the video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. If you have a topic idea for a future vlog, definitely let me know. But check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great day. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GW for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.